My name is Sarah. I'm 32 years old, and 6 months ago, my family threw a celebration dinner when they thought my marriage had finally ended. They popped champagne, made toasts about my freedom, and my mother even ordered a custom cake that read New Beginnings. What they didn't know was that David and I had never actually divorced. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. We had simply decided to let them believe we had while we secretly built something extraordinary together. The look on their faces when David walked into that restaurant as my business partner and co-founder was worth every moment of deception we had endured. Growing up in the suburbs of Denver, I was the middle child in a family that prized conventional success above all else. My older sister Rachel had followed the perfect script, married her college boyfriend at 24, had 2 children by 28, and settled into a comfortable life as a pediatric nurse, while her husband climbed the corporate ladder at a tech company. My younger brother Michael was the golden boy, a software engineer who made 6 figures before turning 25 and dated a string of accomplished women who all met my parents' exacting standards. Then there was me, Sarah Collins, the family. Disappointment, who couldn't seem to color within the lines. I had always been drawn to creative pursuits, spending my childhood writing stories and dreaming of adventures beyond the manicured lawns of our neighborhood. While my siblings excelled in traditional academics, I struggled with math and science, but thrived in English and art classes. My parents, both successful accountants who had built their firm from the ground up, viewed my artistic inclinations as a phase that would eventually give way to more practical interests. During my senior year of high school, I shocked everyone by announcing I wanted to study creative writing in college. The dinner table conversation that followed was one I'll never forget. My father set down his fork with deliberate precision, his face already arranging itself into the disapproving expression I knew so well. "Creative writing isn't a career, Sarah," he said in the measured tone he used when explaining tax law to confused clients. "It's a hobby. You need to think about your future, about stability." My mother, always the peacemaker but never quite on my side, suggested I consider journalism instead. "At least that's a real profession," she said, reaching across the table, to pat my hand in that condescending way that made my skin crawl. "You could work for a newspaper or a magazine, much more practical than whatever creative writing leads to." But I was stubborn, a trait I had inherited from both parents, whether they wanted to acknowledge it or not. I applied to colleges with strong creative writing programs and managed to secure a partial scholarship to a small liberal arts school in Colorado Springs. My parents attended my graduation, but their congratulations felt hollow, tinged with the unspoken hope that I would come to my senses and choose a more sensible path for graduate school. College was where I discovered my voice, both as a writer and as a person, separate from my family's expectations. I thrived in workshop environments, collaborated on the literary magazine, and for the first time in my life, felt like I belonged somewhere. My professors encouraged my unconventional thinking, and my peers appreciated the perspective I brought to discussions. I was finally in an environment where being different was valued rather than merely tolerated. It was during my junior year that I met David Chen in what seemed like the most unlikely of circumstances. I was working part-time at the campus coffee shop to help pay for textbooks and rent, pulling early morning shifts before my afternoon creative writing seminars. David was a business major who came in every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 7:15, ordering the same thing, a large black coffee and a blueberry scone. He was always impeccably dressed, even for 8 a.m. classes, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that I found both intimidating and intriguing. For weeks, our interaction was limited to the standard coffee shop exchange: order, payment, polite thank you. But David was observant, and he began to notice the notebooks I kept behind the counter, filled with story fragments and character sketches that I worked on during slow periods. One particularly quiet Thursday morning, he lingered after receiving his order, glancing at the open notebook beside the register. "You're a writer," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. His voice had a warmth that surprised me, given his usually business-like demeanor. "Trying to be?" I replied, suddenly self-conscious about the messy handwriting and crossed-out lines that covered the visible page. "What kind of stories do you write?" he asked, settling against the counter as if he had all the time in the world, rather than a class to attend in 15 minutes. That conversation stretched far longer than either of us had intended. David missed his first class, and I barely noticed when my manager arrived to start the next shift. We discovered that despite our seemingly different interests, we shared a fascination with storytelling. David approached it from a business perspective, interested in how companies crafted narratives to connect with consumers, while I was drawn to the human stories that revealed universal truths about the experience of being alive. As our friendship developed over the following months, I learned that David's polished exterior hid someone far more complex and creative than his business major suggested. He had grown up in a family that valued academic achievement and financial success, much like mine. But he harbored dreams of entrepreneurship that his parents viewed with skepticism. While they wanted him to follow a traditional path into corporate management, David was drawn to the idea of building something from scratch, of creating rather than simply maintaining. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Our late-night conversations in coffee shops and empty classrooms revealed surprising similarities in our family dynamics. Both of us were viewed as the children with potential who were wasting it on impractical pursuits. David's parents had immigrated from Taiwan with advanced degrees in engineering and medicine, sacrificing enormously to build a life in America, and they couldn't understand why their son would risk that security on uncertain ventures. My parents, having worked their way up from modest backgrounds to professional success, were equally bewildered by my rejection of the stability they had fought to achieve. The transition from friendship to romance happened gradually, then all at once. It began with David walking me home after late study sessions, evolved into weekend adventures exploring the mountains outside Colorado Springs, and culminated in a kiss outside my apartment on a snowy February evening that felt like the most natural thing in the world. We fit together in ways that surprised us both, balancing each other's strengths and compensating for weaknesses with an ease that made our relationship feel effortless, even when the external pressures mounted. By senior year, David and I were inseparable, but we were also keeping our relationship largely private from our families. I had introduced him to my parents during one of their rare visits to campus, presenting him as a friend and study partner rather than my boyfriend. My mother had approved of his academic focus and polite demeanor, while my father appreciated David's business acumen and practical approach to life. They seemed to view him as a positive influence who might steer me toward more realistic career goals. David's parents knew about me in similarly limited terms. He had mentioned having a friend who was helping him with writing assignments and presentation skills, which they saw as a beneficial academic relationship. The careful way we presented our connection to our families wasn't born from shame about each other, but rather from a mutual understanding that our relationship would become another point of contention in already complicated family dynamics. After graduation, we made the bold decision to move to Portland together, drawn by the city's reputation for creativity and entrepreneurship. I had been accepted into a prestigious MFA program at Portland State University, while David planned to gain some business experience before pursuing his entrepreneurial dreams. My family's reaction to the move was predictably mixed. They were relieved that I was continuing my education, hoping that an MFA might lead to teaching opportunities. But they were concerned about my decision to move so far from home with someone they barely knew. "You're making major life decisions, based on a college relationship," my mother said during one of our weekly phone calls. These things rarely last beyond graduation, Sarah. What happens when you realize you want different things? My father was more direct in his concerns. This David seems like a nice young man, but you're building your life around someone else's plans, he told me during a visit home for Christmas. You should be focused on your own career development, not following a boyfriend to another state. What? Their skepticism hurt, but it also strengthened my resolve. David and I had spent countless hours discussing our individual goals and how they might align without either of us sacrificing our dreams for the other. We weren't simply following each other blindly. We were choosing to build something together while maintaining our separate identities and ambitions. Portland proved to be everything we had hoped for and more challenging than we had anticipated. The cost of living was higher than we had budgeted for, and finding work that paid well enough to support our goals while leaving time for creative pursuits was an ongoing struggle. I waitressed at an upscale restaurant downtown while attending graduate classes, writing whenever I could steal moments between shifts and assignments. David took a position with a mid-sized marketing firm, learning the business while quietly developing ideas for his own company. Our first year in Portland tested our relationship in ways we hadn't anticipated. The stress of financial uncertainty, demanding schedules, and the pressure to prove ourselves in a new city created friction that we hadn't experienced during the relative safety of college life. There were nights when we fell into bed exhausted and barely speaking, mornings when the alarm felt like a punishment, and weekends that disappeared into catch-up work and household chores. But there were also moments of incredible clarity and connection. Late nights spent talking through story ideas and business concepts that seemed to flow naturally from one to the other. Weekend hikes in the Columbia River Gorge where we would dream aloud about the life we were building together. Quiet mornings in coffee shops where I would write while David sketched out business plans, our individual work somehow enhanced by the other's presence. It was during my second year of graduate school that David first mentioned his idea for a content marketing company that would specialize in storytelling for small businesses. He had been working with several local entrepreneurs, helping them develop their brand narratives, and had begun to see patterns in what made some stories resonate while others fell flat. His business background gave him insight into market positioning and strategy, but he found himself increasingly drawn to the creative aspects of the work. I keep thinking about what you said about universal truths in individual stories. He told me one evening as we walked through our neighborhood after dinner. These business owners have incredible personal stories that led them to start their companies, but they don't know how to tell them in ways that connect with customers. There's a real need for someone who understands both the business side and the storytelling craft. I was immediately intrigued by the concept, not just because it aligned with my interests, but because I could see how David's idea could fill a genuine gap in the market. During my MFA program, I had become increasingly interested in narrative nonfiction and the ways that well-told true stories could be more compelling than fiction. The idea of applying those skills to help entrepreneurs share their authentic experiences seemed like a natural bridge between artistic expression and practical application. We began collaborating informally, with David bringing me into conversations with his clients, and me helping to develop written content that captured their voices and visions. What started as occasional assistance evolved into a regular partnership, and we discovered that our different perspectives and skills complemented each other perfectly. David excelled at understanding the strategic goals and target audiences, while I had a knack for finding the emotional core of each story and translating it into compelling narrative. Our families remained largely unaware of this growing collaboration. To them, I was still a graduate student pursuing an impractical degree while David worked a respectable job in marketing. They didn't know about the late nights we spent developing brand stories, the weekend strategy sessions disguised as casual coffee dates, or the growing client base that was beginning to see real results from our combined approach. The decision to formalize our partnership came during my final semester of graduate school. David's supervisor at the marketing firm had been increasingly resistant to his creative approaches, preferring traditional advertising methods that felt outdated and ineffective. Meanwhile, I was facing pressure from my family to make concrete plans for life after graduation, with my father suggesting I consider pursuing a teaching certificate as a backup plan. "What if we didn't need backup plans?" David asked one evening as we reviewed the portfolio of work we had created together. "What if we were brave enough to bet on ourselves?" The question hung in the air between us, laden with possibility and risk. We had been talking around the idea of starting our own company for months, but actually taking that step felt enormous. It would mean leaving the security of David's steady job and rejecting my family's expectations for more conventional employment. It would also mean officially acknowledging that our relationship had evolved beyond romance into a true partnership, in every sense of the word. That night, we spread our financial records across the kitchen table and ran the numbers with brutal honesty. We had been living frugally for 2 years, saving as much as possible while building our skills and client base. We had enough savings to cover basic expenses for 6 months if we were careful, and we already had several clients willing to commit to larger projects if we could dedicate more time to their accounts. More importantly, we had something that neither of us possessed alone: a complete skill set that addressed both the creative and business aspects of our field. David brought strategic thinking, financial management, and business development expertise, while I contributed writing ability, creative vision, and the academic rigor I had developed through my MFA program. Together, we could offer services that most of our competitors provided only partially. The conversation continued for days, evolving from tentative possibility to concrete planning. We researched business registration requirements, developed a basic marketing strategy, and began reaching out to our network of contacts to gauge interest in our services. The response was more encouraging than we had dared to hope, with several potential clients expressing enthusiasm about working with a team that could handle both strategy and execution. My thesis defense was scheduled for early May, and we decided that if I passed, we would use the graduation ceremony as our unofficial launch date. It felt symbolically appropriate to begin this new chapter immediately after I completed my formal education, and it gave us a concrete deadline to finalize our business plans. The weeks leading up to graduation were intense in ways I hadn't anticipated. Along with the usual stress of final projects and thesis defense preparation, David and I were secretly laying the groundwork for our company. We registered the business, name, opened bank accounts, developed our initial service offerings, and created basic marketing materials. We were essentially living double lives, maintaining the appearance of students and employees while building the foundation for our entrepreneurial venture. My family announced their intention to attend my graduation ceremony, which filled me with both pride and anxiety. This would be the first time they would spend extended time with David, and I wasn't sure how to present our relationship and future plans without triggering their concerns about my practical decision-making abilities. David's parents were also planning to attend, flying in from California to celebrate what they hoped would be his transition into a more serious phase of his business career. They had been encouraging him to pursue an MBA or seek promotion opportunities within his current company, and they were unaware that he was planning to leave his job immediately after graduation. The week before graduation, we made the decision that would ultimately lead to the family celebration of our supposed divorce months later. Rather than reveal our business partnership and romantic relationship simultaneously, creating multiple points of potential conflict with both sets of parents, we decided to maintain the fiction that we were simply friends and roommates who had helped each other through school. "Let them think whatever they want to think," David said, as we practiced our responses to likely questions from family members. "We'll tell them the truth when the business is established and profitable. Right now, they'll just see it as another impractical dream that we should abandon before we waste time and money on it." I agreed, though part of me felt uncomfortable with the deception. We weren't lying exactly, but we were certainly not being fully honest about the nature of our relationship or our immediate plans. Still, Given our family's track records of responding to our unconventional choices with concern and criticism, it seemed like the path of least resistance while we got our business off the ground. Graduation day arrived with the kind of perfect, spring weather that made Portland feel like the most beautiful city in the world. My family had driven up from Denver the day before, and were staying at a hotel downtown, while David's parents had flown in that morning and were staying with us. In our small apartment, the logistics of managing both families while maintaining our careful fiction created an undercurrent of tension that only David and I could feel. The ceremony itself was beautiful and anticlimactic in the way that all graduations are. After 2 years of intensive study and creative work, the actual moment of receiving my diploma felt brief and surreal. But seeing the pride on my parents' faces as I walked across the stage, even if it was mixed with uncertainty about my future, reminded me that their concern came from love even when it felt like judgment. The celebration dinner that evening was our first test of maintaining our cover story in front of both families. David and I had reserved a table at one of Portland's best restaurants, presenting it as a joint celebration of my graduation and his completion of his first year in the working world. We carefully managed the conversation, steering it away from topics that might reveal too much about our plans while ensuring that both sets of parents felt included and valued. My father dominated much of the conversation, asking David detailed questions about his work in marketing and offering advice about career advancement that David accepted graciously while knowing he was about to reject everything my father suggested. My mother focused on my thesis project, expressing surprise at how professionally written and researched it was, as if she had expected my graduate work to be as impractical as she viewed my undergraduate creative writing. David's parents were equally revealing in their assumptions and expectations. They praised my influence on their son's communication skills, while suggesting that my academic achievements might help me find a position at a university or research institution. They clearly saw me as a stabilizing influence who might encourage David to pursue more traditional success markers like graduate school or corporate advancement. As the evening wound down, both families seemed satisfied that David and I were positive influences on each other while remaining appropriately focused on our individual career development. They approved of our friendship while assuming it would naturally fade as we moved into the next phases of our lives. We smiled and nodded, accepting their congratulations and advice while knowing that we were about to prove every assumption they had made completely wrong. The following Monday, David submitted his resignation letter to the marketing firm, citing a desire to pursue entrepreneurial opportunities. I began reaching out to the clients we had been working with informally, letting them know that we were now available for larger projects with faster turnaround times. We officially launched Collins Chen Creative Solutions exactly 1 week after my graduation, with a website, business cards, and enough initial contracts to pay our rent for the first 3 months. The response from our families was swift and predictable. When David called his parents to explain his career change, his father's disappointment was palpable even through the phone. "You're throwing away everything you've worked for," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his own sacrifices. "This company will fail like most small businesses do, and then what? You'll be 30 years old with nothing to show for your education." My parents' reaction was equally discouraging, though their concern focused more on my involvement in what they saw as David's risky venture. "You just finished graduate school," my mother pointed out during a tense phone conversation. "You should be looking for stable employment that uses your education, not getting pulled into someone else's business experiment." "This isn't about following David," I tried to explain. "This is my business too. We're partners." "Partners in what sense?" my father asked, and I could hear the concern in his voice about whether my involvement was professional or personal, or some combination that he didn't trust. I found myself dancing around the truth again, emphasizing the business aspects of our partnership while downplaying the romantic relationship that provided its foundation. It felt dishonest, but their reactions to our career choices suggested that revealing the full extent of our partnership would only multiply their concerns rather than address them. Over the following months, as Collins Chen Creative Solutions grew from a hopeful startup to a profitable small business, the gap between our actual success and our family's perception of our situation widened dramatically. We were winning clients, generating revenue, and building a reputation in Portland's business community, but to our parents, we remained young people making impractical choices that would inevitably lead to disappointment and financial hardship. The pressure from both families intensified as our first year in business progressed. David's parents staged what amounted to an intervention during a visit in the fall, bringing printed job listings and contact information for MBA programs. My family took a different approach, expressing their concerns through a steady stream of questions about my financial stability and suggestions for more realistic career options. "You can't live on dreams forever," my sister Rachel told me during one of our increasingly strained phone calls. "At some point, you need to think about your future. What happens when this business fails? What happens when you and David realize you want different things?" The constant skepticism and criticism from our families began to affect our relationship with them in ways we hadn't anticipated. Phone calls became exercises in carefully editing our lives, sharing only the information that wouldn't trigger lectures or expressions of concern. Family visits felt like performances where we had to downplay our successes to avoid seeming defensive, while also concealing the true extent of our partnership. It was during this period of increasing family tension that David and I made the decision that would ultimately lead to the celebration dinner that began this story. If our families were determined to disapprove of our choices regardless of how successful we became, perhaps it was time to give them something they could approve of: the end of our supposedly doomed partnership. What if we let them think we broke up? David suggested one evening, after a particularly difficult conversation with his mother, about his need to settle down with someone appropriate. What if we told them the business partnership wasn't working and we decided to go our separate ways? The idea was both appealing and terrifying. On one hand, it would give us the freedom to build our business and relationship without constant external pressure and criticism. On the other hand, it felt like a fundamental betrayal of who we were and what we had built together. We could tell them I'm focusing on freelance writing while you're going back to traditional marketing, I said, thinking through the logistics. They'd see it as both of us coming to our senses and making more practical choices. And they'd stop worrying about us wasting our lives on an unrealistic dream, David added. We could actually enjoy family visits instead of defending every decision we've made. The more we discussed it, the more sense it made as a temporary solution. We weren't planning to maintain the deception forever, just long enough to establish ourselves so thoroughly that our families would have to acknowledge our success rather than dismiss it as a phase. We would let them believe we had broken up and gone our separate ways while actually continuing to work together and live together as we always had. The conversation about how to present our supposed breakup to our families was surprisingly difficult. We had to create a believable narrative that explained why our business partnership had failed without making either of us seem like the villain. We also had to coordinate our stories carefully so that details wouldn't conflict if our families compared notes, which they inevitably would. We decided to frame it as a mutual recognition that we wanted different things from the business, with me preferring creative projects and David focusing on corporate clients. We would say that we had tried to make it work, but ultimately realized that our approaches were too different to sustain a partnership. The romantic relationship, we would claim, hadn't survived the stress of working together and trying to build a business. "It's not really lying," David said, as we practiced our separate phone calls to family members. "We do want different things. Sometimes, and business partnerships are stressful. We're just exaggerating those conflicts and creating a conclusion that didn't actually happen." I nodded, though I felt uncomfortable with the level of deception we were planning. Still, the alternative was continuing to defend our choices and our relationship to people who seemed determined to disapprove regardless of our actual success or happiness. The execution of our plan was more emotionally difficult than either of us had anticipated. Calling my parents to tell them that David and I had broken up and dissolved our business partnership felt like erasing everything we had built together, even though we both knew it was temporary. My mother's relief was audible through the phone, while my father expressed satisfaction that I was finally thinking clearly about my future. "These things happen," my mother said, with the kind of gentle condescension that made my skin crawl. "It's better that you learned this lesson now, rather than after making an even bigger commitment. You're still young enough to start over and make better choices." David's conversations with his parents followed a similar pattern, with his mother expressing gratitude that he was finally ready to pursue more stable opportunities. They immediately began suggesting job openings and networking contacts, thrilled that their son was returning to the path they had always envisioned for him. The hardest part was maintaining the fiction during family visits and phone calls over the following months. David and I had to pretend we barely spoke anymore, creating elaborate stories about our separate living situations and new professional directions. We rented a small office space downtown where we could work during the day, maintaining our home as our actual residence while telling our families we had found separate apartments. The business continued to thrive during this period of family deception, but the emotional toll of constantly lying about our lives began to wear on both of us. We were proud of what we had accomplished, but we couldn't share that pride with the people whose approval we had spent our entire lives seeking. Instead, we watched them celebrate what they thought was our failure, while secretly building something more successful than they had ever imagined possible. Collins Chen Creative Solutions expanded its client base, hired 2 part-time employees, and began receiving recognition in industry publications. David and I were invited to speak at conferences about our innovative approach to small business marketing, and several larger companies approached us about potential acquisitions. We were living the entrepreneurial dream that our families had, dismissed as impossible, but we couldn't tell them any of it. The breaking point came 6 months later, when my parents announced they wanted to take me out for a celebration dinner to mark what they saw as my successful transition back to practical career choices. They had heard through family friends that I was doing well as a freelance writer, and they wanted to express their pride in my decision to end my business experiment and focus on more realistic goals. "We're so proud of how you've handled this difficult situation," my father said when he called to arrange the dinner. "It takes real maturity to recognize when something isn't working and make the necessary changes. This is the kind of practical thinking that will serve you well throughout your career." David and I stared at each other as I took the call, both of us realizing that our deception had reached a level that felt impossible to maintain. My family wanted to celebrate the end of everything that mattered most to me, while David's parents were planning a similar gesture of support for his supposed return to conventional employment. "We have to tell them the truth," I said after hanging up the phone. "I can't sit through a dinner where they congratulate me for giving up on my dreams, when I've actually achieved more than I ever thought possible. But if we tell them now, they'll know we've been lying for months," David pointed out. "They'll be hurt and angry about the deception, and they still won't believe that the business is actually successful." We found ourselves trapped by our own fiction, unable to continue the charade but afraid of the consequences of revealing the truth. The celebration dinner was scheduled for the following week, and we had to decide whether to maintain our cover story or risk destroying our relationships with our families by admitting to months of deliberate deception. That's when David had the idea that would change everything. What if we turned their celebration into our revelation? What if we let them throw their party congratulating us for ending our partnership, and then showed them exactly what we had really accomplished together? "They want to celebrate our failure," David said, pacing around our office space as the plan took shape in his mind. "What if we let them start that celebration, and then we walk in together and show them the contracts, the client testimonials, the revenue reports? What if we prove to them that everything they thought was a disaster is actually the biggest success either of us has ever had? The audacity of the plan both thrilled and terrified me. It would mean orchestrating an elaborate reveal that could either vindicate everything we had worked for or destroy our relationships with our families completely. But the alternative was continuing to live a lie that was eating away at both of us, pretending to be failures while secretly building something extraordinary. We spent the next week carefully planning every detail of what we came to call the reveal dinner. I would go to the celebration my parents had planned, playing the role of the grateful daughter who had learned from her mistakes. David would make an excuse for why he couldn't attend, claiming he had other commitments that evening. Then, at the perfect moment, he would arrive at the restaurant with a portfolio of our business success, ready to show my family exactly what we had built together. The psychological preparation was almost as important as the logistical planning. We rehearsed our presentation, anticipating every possible reaction from shocked disbelief to outright anger. We organized our business records into a compelling narrative that would be impossible to dismiss or minimize. Most importantly, we steeled ourselves for the possibility that our families might reject the truth, even when presented with undeniable evidence of our success. The week leading up to the dinner felt like preparing for battle. My parents called repeatedly to confirm details and express their excitement about celebrating what they saw as my return to sensible decision-making. Each conversation was a masterclass in self-control as I listened to them praise choices I had never made while dismissing achievements they didn't know existed. "We've invited Rachel and Michael too," my mother told me during one of these calls. "This feels like such an important moment for you, and we want the whole family to be there to support you. Uncle Tom and Aunt Linda are driving down from Fort Collins, and even your cousin Jessica is coming." My stomach clenched as I realized the dinner had evolved from a small family celebration into a major family gathering. What we had planned, as a reveal to my immediate family, would now involve aunts, uncles, and cousins who had all been told some version of the story about my failed business and broken relationship. The stakes had just become exponentially higher. David and I spent that evening revising our plan to account for the larger audience. We practiced our presentation again, this time imagining a room full of relatives who had been led to believe they were celebrating my recovery from poor judgment. The pressure felt enormous, but it also crystallized our determination to finally tell the truth about what we had accomplished. The night before the dinner, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined different scenarios for how the evening might unfold. In some versions, my family listened to our presentation with growing amazement and pride, finally understanding what we had built together. In others, they refused to believe the evidence we presented, dismissing our success as temporary or somehow fraudulent. In the worst scenarios, they felt so betrayed by our months of deception that they rejected both our business success and our relationship entirely. David was dealing with his own anxiety about the plan. His parents had scheduled their own celebration, dinner for the following weekend, and we had decided to use the same approach with them if the reveal to my family went well. The prospect of repeating this high-stakes performance twice within a week added another layer of stress to an already intense situation. "What if we're making a mistake?" I asked him as we lay awake at 3 a.m, both of us too nervous to sleep. "What if the truth makes everything worse instead of better?" "It can't get worse," David replied, his voice quiet but certain in the darkness. "We're already lying to everyone we love about the most important things in our lives. Even if they react badly to the truth, at least we'll finally be able to be honest about who we are and what we've accomplished." His words reminded me of why we had started this deception in the first place and why we needed to end it now. The success of Collins Chen Creative Solutions had exceeded our wildest expectations, but it felt hollow when we couldn't share it with our families. We had built something extraordinary together, but we were living like it was shameful secret instead of our greatest achievement. The day of the dinner arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Denver feel like the most beautiful place on earth. I spent the morning getting ready with the care of someone preparing for a performance, choosing an outfit that looked professional enough to suggest success, but not so polished that it would raise questions about my supposedly struggling freelance career. My parents had chosen Romano's, one of the nicest Italian restaurants in the city, as the venue for what they thought would be a celebration of my practical choices. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were spending more money on this dinner than they had on any previous celebration of my actual achievements. They had never taken me out for an expensive meal when I graduated summa cum laude from college, or when I was accepted into graduate school, or when I completed my MFA. But they were happy to splurge when they thought I had given up on my dreams. I arrived at the restaurant precisely on time, my stomach churning with anticipation and dread. The hostess led me to a private dining room in the back where my family had already gathered around a large round table. The sight of so many relatives in one place, all there to celebrate what they thought was my failure, nearly overwhelmed me with the magnitude of what David and I were about to attempt. "There she is," my father announced as I entered the room, his voice warm with pride and satisfaction. "The guest of honor who finally learned to make smart decisions." The chorus of greetings that followed felt surreal. Uncle Tom clapped me on the shoulder and congratulated me on my maturity. Aunt Linda hugged me and expressed relief that I had come to my senses. My cousin Jessica, only a year older than me but already established in her accounting career, told me how proud she was that I had chosen stability over fantasy. Each comment felt like a small wound, not because they were intentionally cruel, but because they revealed how little my family understood about what truly mattered to me. They were celebrating the death of my dreams, while I sat there knowing that those dreams had actually come true beyond anything I had dared to imagine. My brother Michael had prepared a toast for the occasion, and he stood up as the appetizers were being served, his wine glass raised in my direction. "To Sarah," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had always made the right choices. "For having the courage to admit when something wasn't working and the wisdom to change course before it was too late. You've shown real growth and maturity, and we're all proud of you for making the hard but necessary decisions." The table erupted in agreement, with everyone raising their glasses to toast my supposed wisdom in abandoning everything that made me happy. I lifted my own glass with a smile that felt like it might crack my face, knowing that in less than an hour, every assumption they had just celebrated would be proven completely wrong. The conversation during dinner focused heavily on my future, plans and the lessons I had learned from my business experiment. My relatives took turns sharing advice about the importance of practical career choices and the dangers of getting involved in romantic relationships that complicated professional decisions. Every piece of wisdom they offered was based on a complete misunderstanding of my actual situation. "The important thing is that you recognize the problem before you wasted any more time," my sister Rachel said, cutting into her chicken parmesan with the satisfied air of someone whose life had always followed the approved script. "Some people spend years chasing impossible dreams instead of building something real." "David seemed like a nice enough young man," my mother added, "but business partnerships with romantic partners almost never work out. You saved yourself a lot of heartache by ending both relationships before they could do more damage." I nodded and smiled, playing my role perfectly while inside I was screaming with frustration. They were so confident in their understanding of my situation, so certain that their conventional wisdom had been proven correct, that they couldn't imagine any other possible interpretation of events. As the main course was being cleared away, my phone buzzed with a text from David. "Outside now. Ready when you are." My heart rate immediately doubled as I realized that the moment we had been planning for weeks was finally at hand. In a few minutes, everything would change, and there would be no going back to the comfortable lies we had been living. "I have a surprise for everyone," I announced, Standing up from my chair with what I hoped looked like spontaneous excitement rather than carefully planned drama, someone special wanted to join us tonight to help celebrate this new chapter in my life. My family looked puzzled but pleased, probably assuming I had arranged for flowers to be delivered or invited a friend to join the celebration. They had no idea that I was about to fundamentally challenge every assumption they had made about my life over the past 6 months. I walked to the entrance of the private dining room and opened the door to find David standing in the hallway, impeccably dressed in his best suit and carrying a leather portfolio that contained the evidence of everything we had built together. He looked calm and confident, but I could see the tension in his shoulders and the determination in his eyes. "Everyone," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I'd like you to meet my business partner." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as confusion rippled across the faces around the table, followed quickly by shock as they began to process what they were seeing. David stepped into the room with the kind of quiet confidence that had attracted me to him in the first place. But now that confidence was backed by months of business success and the satisfaction of finally being able to tell the truth. "Good evening," David said, addressing the table with professional courtesy. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance, but Sarah and I have something important to share with all of you." My father was the first to find his voice, his confusion evident in every word. "David? I thought you and Sarah had broken up. I thought you dissolved your business partnership months ago." "That's what we let you believe," I said, taking my seat again as David moved to stand beside me. "But the truth is that our business has been more successful than either of us ever imagined possible. This is our business plan for next year," he said. "We're opening a second office in Seattle and hiring 4 full-time employees. We've been approached by 2 different venture capital firms about potential investment, and we're considering offers to acquire smaller competitors. This isn't a phase or an experiment anymore. This is our career, and we're very good at it." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and I felt a surge of gratitude for his willingness to stand with me. In this moment of truth, we had built something remarkable together, and for the first time in months, we were able to say that out loud to the people whose opinions had shaped our entire lives. Uncle Tom had been quietly studying the financial documents while the rest of the family processed the personal revelations. "I have to ask," he said, looking up from a profit and loss statement, "why didn't you just tell us this from the beginning? These numbers would have impressed anyone. Your parents would have been proud of this level of success." "Would they?" I asked, genuinely uncertain. When I told them I wanted to study creative writing, they said it wasn't a real career. When David and I started the business, they warned us about the dangers of mixing business with romance. When we moved to Portland, they worried we were making major life decisions based on a college relationship. Every choice we made that deviated from their script was met with concern and criticism. "But this is different," my mother protested. "This is actual success. This is proof that your choices worked out." "It's proof that our choices worked out," I corrected. "But you couldn't see that possibility when we were in the process of making those choices. You could only see the ways they differed from what you thought we should do." David squeezed my hand as I spoke, a silent reminder that we were in this together. The conversation was difficult, but it was also liberating in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. For the first time in months, I was being completely honest about my life, my relationship, and my achievements. The fear of their disapproval was still there, but it was balanced by the pride of finally being able to tell the truth. My brother Michael had been unusually quiet during the revelations, but now he cleared his throat and addressed David directly. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice formal but sincere. "I made assumptions about your relationship with my sister and your business prospects that were clearly wrong. I'm impressed by what you've accomplished together." The acknowledgement from Michael meant more than I had expected. As the family member whose choices had always been approved and celebrated, his validation carried particular weight. It suggested that maybe Eventually, the rest of the family might be able to revise their understanding of what constituted success and good judgment. We didn't do this to embarrass anyone, I said, addressing the table as a whole. We did it because we were tired of hiding the most important parts of our lives. We wanted you to see what we had built together instead of continuing to worry about what you thought we had destroyed. But the deception, my father said, shaking his head slowly. The months of letting us believe something that wasn't true. How do we move forward from that? It was a fair question, and one that David and I had discussed extensively without reaching a satisfying answer. We had chosen deception as a temporary solution to family pressure, but we had underestimated how difficult it would be to unwind that deception without causing additional hurt. We moved forward by acknowledging that we were all wrong about different things, David said thoughtfully. You were wrong to assume that our business would fail and our relationship wouldn't last. We were wrong to let you continue believing those assumptions instead of proving them incorrect with evidence. But we're all here now, with the truth on the table, and we can decide how to proceed from here. Aunt Linda, who had been silent throughout most of the revelations, suddenly spoke up. I think what impresses me most is how well you work together, she said, looking between David and me with something approaching admiration. The presentation you just gave, the way you supported each other through what must have been a very difficult conversation, the business you've built that clearly requires both of your skills. Collins Chen Creative Solutions has grown from a startup to a thriving company with major clients, steady revenue, and a reputation that's getting us invited to speak at industry conferences. The silence stretched longer this time as my family struggled to process this information. I could see my mother's face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and the beginning of something that might have been anger. My father's expression had gone completely blank, the way it did when he encountered tax codes that didn't make sense to him. David opened his portfolio and began placing documents on the table with the precision of someone making a business presentation. These are our quarterly revenue reports for the past year, he said, his voice matter-of-fact and professional. As you can see, we've exceeded our projected income in every quarter, and we're on track to double our revenue again next year. Uncle Tom leaned forward to examine the documents, his background in finance making him the first to truly understand what he was seeing. These numbers, he said slowly, these can't be right. This shows revenue that would put you in the top tier of small businesses in the city. They're absolutely correct, I confirmed, feeling a surge of pride that I had been suppressing for months. We've worked with over 50 clients in the past year, including 3 Fortune 500 companies that hired us for major rebranding projects. We've been featured in Fast Company magazine and Portland Business Journal. We're not just surviving. As entrepreneurs, we're thriving. David continued the presentation with client testimonials, industry awards, and photographs from the conferences where we had been invited speakers. Each piece of evidence built on the last, creating an overwhelming case for the success of everything my family thought we had abandoned. This is all very impressive, my sister Rachel said, her voice tight with something between confusion and irritation. But why did you lie to us? Why did you let us think your business had failed and you had broken up? The question I had been dreading finally hung in the air between us. David and I had practiced our response to this moment, but actually facing the hurt and bewilderment in my family's faces made it much more difficult than we had anticipated. Because every time we tried to tell you the truth about our plans, you responded with criticism and concern, I said, my voice steady but sad. When we started the business, you warned us it would fail. When we moved in together, you told us we were making decisions based on a college relationship that wouldn't last. You were so convinced that we were making mistakes that you couldn't see that we were actually building something extraordinary. So you decided to deceive us instead of proving us wrong? My mother asked, her voice carrying the particular tone of disappointment that had shaped my childhood. You let us worry about your future while you were actually successful? You let us celebrate what we thought was your recovery from poor judgment? The hurt in her voice was genuine, and I felt the weight of our deception in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. We had protected ourselves from their criticism, but we had also deprived them of the chance to share in our success and to revise their understanding of our capabilities. We were wrong to deceive you, David said, stepping forward to address my mother directly. We should have had the courage to tell you the truth and let you decide how to respond to it. But we were tired of defending every choice we made and having our relationship and our business treated like mistakes waiting to happen. Your relationship? My father interjected, focusing on the word with laser precision. Are you saying you didn't actually break up either? We never broke up, I confirmed, reaching for David's hand in a gesture that felt both natural and defiant. We've been together through all of this. The business partnership and the romantic relationship have supported each other from the beginning. We're partners in every sense of the word. The revelation seemed to hit my family in waves, with each new piece of information forcing them to revise their understanding of the previous 6 months. They had been celebrating my recovery from what they saw as poor judgment, only to discover that their judgment of my situation had been completely wrong. Cousin Jessica was the first to break the uncomfortable silence that followed. So, you've been lying to us for months about the most important things in your life, she said, her voice sharp with accusation. How are we supposed to trust anything you tell us now? You're not supposed to trust us, I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. You're supposed to look at the evidence of what we've accomplished and decide whether you want to celebrate it or continue to disapprove of it. But you can't pretend anymore that we're failures or that our choices were mistakes. David added another document to the growing pile on the table. You've created something that's greater than the sum of its parts. Her words captured something essential about our partnership that I hadn't been able to articulate even to myself. David and I were better together than either of us could have been separately, not just in business but in every aspect of our lives. The family pressure that had driven us to deception had also obscured this fundamental truth about our relationship. So what happens now? My cousin Jessica asked, her tone shifting from accusatory to genuinely curious. Do you keep expanding the business? Do you stay in Portland? Do you eventually want to have a family? The questions felt like a test of some kind, as if my answers would determine whether my family could accept the life David and I had built together. But they also felt like the first genuine interest my family had shown in my actual plans rather than their preferred version of my future. We keep building, I said simply. The business has momentum now, and we have opportunities we never could have imagined when we started. We love Portland, but we're not tied to it if better opportunities emerge elsewhere. And yes, eventually we want to have a family, but we want to do it on our own timeline, rather than according to anyone else's expectations. My mother's expression softened slightly at the mention of a potential family, and I could see her beginning to reconcile the daughter she thought she knew with the woman who had just revealed a completely different life. It would take time for her to fully process the evening's revelations, but I could sense her starting to shift from disappointment about the deception toward curiosity about the life we had actually built. I'm proud of you, she said suddenly, her voice quiet but clear. I'm hurt that you felt you couldn't tell us the truth, and I'm confused about why you thought we wouldn't support your success. But I'm proud of what you've accomplished, and I'm proud of how you've handled this conversation tonight. The words I had been waiting my entire life to hear, spoken in the context of finally being completely honest about who I was and what I wanted. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had received my mother's approval only after proving that I didn't need it, that I could build a successful life even when she disapproved of my choices. David's phone buzzed with what we both knew was a reminder that his parents' celebration dinner was scheduled for the following weekend. The success of tonight's revelation had given us confidence that we could handle that conversation as well. But it also reminded us that this process of truth-telling was far from over. "We should probably start planning for round 2, I said quietly to David as my family continued to examine the business documents and discuss what they had learned. "After tonight, I think we can handle anything," he replied, and the confidence in his voice matched what I was feeling. We had survived the hardest conversation of our lives and emerged with our relationship and our family connections intact, if fundamentally changed. The dinner ended with tentative plans for my parents to visit Portland and see our office, meet our employees, and understand more fully what we had built together. It wasn't the unconditional approval I had once craved, but it was something better. Respect for who we actually were rather than relief that we had conformed to their expectations. As we gathered our business documents and prepared to leave the restaurant, my father approached David with the careful formality that marked all of his important conversations. "I misjudged you," he said, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "I misjudged both of you. I hope you'll give me the chance to get to know you better, as you actually are, rather than as I assumed you were." The acknowledgement from my father felt like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. We had spent months living a lie to avoid their disapproval, only to discover that the truth was far more powerful than any fiction we could have maintained. Our business was successful, our relationship was strong, and our families were finally seeing us as we really were. The week following our dramatic revelation felt like living in an entirely different world. For months, David and I had carefully compartmentalized our lives, maintaining elaborate fictions during family calls while celebrating real victories in private. Now, suddenly, we could answer the phone without calculating which version of our story to tell. The relief was intoxicating. My mother called 3 times that week, each conversation longer and more genuine than any we'd had since I'd moved to Portland. She asked detailed questions about our clients, wanted to understand how our creative process worked, and even requested copies of the magazine articles that had featured our company. The woman who had spent years encouraging me to pursue more practical career paths was now genuinely curious about the impractical dream that had become our reality. "I keep thinking about what you said," she told me during our longest conversation, "about how we responded to your choices with criticism instead of curiosity. I realize I was so focused on protecting you from disappointment that I couldn't see when protection wasn't what you needed anymore." Her words carried a weight of recognition that felt more valuable than any business award we had received. This wasn't just about acknowledging our success. It was about understanding that our judgment had been sound, even when it diverged from her expectations. David's revelation dinner with his parents was scheduled for Saturday evening, and we spent the intervening days refining our approach based on what we had learned from my family's reaction. His parents had always been more focused on academic achievement and professional advancement than mine, so we decided to emphasize the business metrics and growth projections that would speak to their particular concerns. "They're going to be furious about the deception," David predicted as we organized our presentation materials. "My mother hates being misled even more than she hates impractical career choices." "But they'll also be impressed by the revenue numbers," I pointed out. "Your father spent his entire career building a medical practice from nothing. He understands what it takes to create a successful business." We had reserved a private dining room at David's parents' favorite restaurant, using the same strategy that had worked so well with my family. The difference was that David's parents thought they were celebrating his decision to apply for MBA programs and return to a more traditional corporate track. They had no idea they were about to discover that their son had already built something more valuable than any graduate degree could provide. Dr. Chen and Mrs. Chen arrived precisely on time, dressed in the formal attire they favored for special occasions. They greeted me with polite warmth, still viewing me as the friend who had helped their son through a difficult period, rather than understanding the true nature of our partnership. The irony of their gratitude for my supposed positive influence on David's practical decision-making wasn't lost on either of us. We're so proud of David for recognizing that he needed more business education before pursuing entrepreneurship, Mrs. Chen told me as we waited for our appetizers. Your influence helped him understand the importance of building a strong foundation before taking risks. I smiled and nodded, knowing that in less than an hour she would learn that her son had already taken the risks she thought he was wisely avoiding, and that those risks had paid off beyond anyone's expectations. David had prepared a different approach for his parents, beginning with a detailed explanation of the market research that had led to our business concept. He knew his father would appreciate the analytical thinking behind our strategy, while his mother would be impressed by the systematic way we had built our client base and reputation. Before we talk about my future plans, David said as the main course was being served, I want to share some research I've been doing about entrepreneurship in the creative services industry. He began with industry statistics, market trends, and case studies of successful small businesses that had grown from startup to acquisition. His parents listened with the careful attention they gave to any well-researched presentation, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated their engagement with the material. This is fascinating data, Dr. Chen said, studying a chart that showed revenue growth patterns for creative services companies. But I'm not sure how it relates to your decision to pursue graduate school. It relates because I haven't actually decided to pursue graduate school, David replied, his voice calm but firm. In fact, I've spent the past year building exactly the kind of company that this research describes. The silence that followed was different from the shocked confusion that had greeted our revelation to my family. David's parents processed information more methodically, and I could see them working through the implications of what he had just said with the systematic approach they brought to all complex problems. Mrs. Chen was the first to speak. Are you saying you've been running a business while we thought you were working at the marketing firm? I'm saying I left the marketing firm 8 months ago to focus full-time on the company that Sarah and I built together, David confirmed. Collins Chen Creative Solutions has been our primary source of income for the entire time you thought I was considering graduate school applications. Dr. Chen leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable as he processed this information. And Sarah is your business partner in this venture? Sarah is my business partner, my creative collaborator, and my romantic partner, David said, reaching for my hand in a gesture that seemed both natural and deliberate. We've been building this company and this relationship together since we graduated, and both have been more successful than either of us dared to hope. The methodical way David presented the information seemed to help his parents process it more easily than my family had. Instead of reacting with immediate emotion, they asked practical questions about our business model, revenue streams, and growth projections. It was like watching a medical consultation where they gathered all available data before reaching a diagnosis. These financial projections, Mrs. Chen said, studying the documents David had provided, they show consistent growth over multiple quarters. How long have you been profitable? We've been profitable since month 4, I replied, grateful for the opportunity to contribute to the conversation. We exceeded our break-even projections in every quarter, and we're currently operating at a profit margin that most established firms would envy. Dr. Chen asked detailed questions about our client retention rates, competitive advantages, and plans for scaling the business. His medical background had given him a systematic approach to evaluating business opportunities, and I could see him applying that same analytical framework to understanding what we had built. I'm impressed by the rigor of your approach, he admitted after reviewing our business plan. This level of planning and execution suggests genuine business acumen, not just creative enthusiasm. The acknowledgement from Dr. Chen carried particular weight because it came from someone who had built his own successful practice through careful planning and systematic execution. His approval wasn't based on sentiment or family loyalty, but on professional assessment of what we had accomplished. Mrs. Chen's concerns were more focused on the personal aspects of our partnership. Running a business together and maintaining a romantic relationship, she said thoughtfully. That's incredibly challenging even for experienced entrepreneurs. How do you manage the potential conflicts between business decisions and personal feelings? We've had to learn to compartmentalize, David explained. We have specific times and spaces for business discussions, and we've developed protocols for handling disagreements that keep professional conflicts from affecting our personal relationship. More importantly, I added, we discovered that our different strengths actually complement each other better in business than we expected. David's strategic thinking balances my creative instincts, while my communication skills help him present his ideas more effectively. We're better business partners because we understand each other so completely as romantic partners. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with David's parents asking increasingly detailed questions about our operations, our competition, and our long-term vision. Unlike my family's focus on the emotional aspects of our deception, David's parents seemed more interested in understanding the business fundamentals that supported our claims of success. I have to ask about the deception, Mrs. Chen finally said, addressing the issue that had dominated my family's reaction. Why did you feel you couldn't tell us the truth about your business and your relationship? David's answer was more measured than mine had been, reflecting his understanding of his parents' particular sensibilities. You raised me to value careful planning and risk management, he said. When Sarah and I decided to start this business, we knew you would see it as premature and poorly planned, even though we had done extensive research and preparation. We thought it would be easier to prove our success first and explain our choices afterward. But we also robbed you of the opportunity to support us during the challenging early stages, I added, wanting to acknowledge the cost of our deception. We were so focused on avoiding your disapproval that we forgot you might have been able to offer valuable advice and encouragement if you had understood what we were actually trying to accomplish. Dr. Chen nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he was weighing multiple factors in reaching his conclusion. Your approach was flawed, he said finally, but your business fundamentals are sound. I can understand why you felt the need to protect your venture during its vulnerable early stages, even if I don't approve of the deception you used to do it. Mrs. Chen's assessment was similarly nuanced. I'm disappointed that you didn't trust us with the truth, she said. But I'm impressed by what you've accomplished together. The business you've built demonstrates exactly the kind of careful planning and systematic execution that we hoped you would develop. The evening ended with tentative plans for David's parents to visit our Portland office and meet our employees. Like my family, they seemed to need time to fully process the gap between their assumptions about our lives and the reality we had finally revealed. But their questions and comments suggested genuine curiosity about our business, rather than skepticism about our choices. As we drove home from the restaurant, David and I felt the same sense of liberation we had experienced after my family's dinner. We had survived both revelation conversations with our relationships intact and our business accomplishments finally acknowledged. The months of deception were behind us, and we could focus entirely on building our future together. The following. Monday brought an unexpected phone call from my brother Michael. I've been thinking about your presentation all week, he said, his voice carrying a respect that I had never heard from him before. I work with marketing firms all the time in my job, and most of them can't deliver the kind of results you showed us. You've built something genuinely impressive. His validation meant more than I had expected, partly because it came from someone whose business judgment I respected, but mostly because it represented a fundamental shift in how my family viewed my capabilities. Michael had always been the child whose choices were automatically approved, while mine were subject to constant scrutiny and concern. Hearing him acknowledge my professional accomplishments felt like a healing of wounds I hadn't fully realized I was carrying. Over the Following weeks, both of our families began reaching out with genuine interest in our business and our lives together. My parents asked for introductions to some of our clients who might need accounting services. David's parents offered to connect us with medical practices that could benefit from our marketing expertise. For the first time since we had moved to Portland, our families were actively supporting our professional goals rather than questioning them. The personal transformation was equally significant. David and I found that we communicated more openly about everything, once we no longer had to maintain careful boundaries between the truth and the fiction we presented to our families. Our business discussions became more creative and ambitious, while our personal conversations gained depth and honesty that had been constrained by the energy we spent managing our deceptions. 6 months after our revelation dinners, Collins Chen Creative Solutions landed its biggest client yet, a major technology company that was restructuring its entire brand identity. The project would require us to hire additional staff, expand our office space, and develop new service capabilities. More importantly, it represented validation from the business community that we had achieved the kind of success our families had thought impossible. I called my mother to share the news, and for the first time in my adult life, I heard unqualified pride in her voice. "I'm so proud of what you've built," she said, her words carrying none of the conditional approval that had characterized our previous conversations. "You've proven that following your instincts and working hard can lead to exactly the kind of success we always wanted for you." David's parents had a similar reaction when he shared the news with them. Dr. Chen offered to invest in our expansion, while Mrs. Chen suggested business contacts who might be interested in our services. They had moved from skepticism about our choices to active support for our continued growth. The most profound change was in how David and I saw ourselves and our relationship. We had built something extraordinary together, but we had spent so much energy hiding it that we hadn't fully appreciated what we had accomplished. Living openly about our partnership, both professional and personal, allowed us to finally enjoy the fruits of our labor without constantly calculating which aspects of our success we could safely share. A year after our revelation dinners, we received an offer to sell Collins Chen Creative Solutions to a larger marketing conglomerate for an amount that would have seemed impossible when we started the business. We declined the offer, not because it wasn't financially attractive, but because we had finally built something that was entirely our own, and we weren't ready to give up that independence. Our family's reactions to our decision to reject the acquisition offer demonstrated how completely their understanding of our judgment had evolved. Instead of questioning our choice or expressing concern about our financial future, they supported our decision to maintain control of the company we had built. My father even offered business advice about negotiating future offers from a position of strength rather than accepting the first significant proposal. The most meaningful validation came from my cousin Jessica, who called to ask for advice about starting her own accounting practice. "Watching what you and David accomplished made me realize that taking risks isn't the same as being reckless," she said. "You showed our whole family that sometimes the unconventional choice is actually the wisest one." Looking back on the elaborate deception that had nearly consumed our lives, David and I both understood that it had been unnecessary from the beginning. Our family's initial skepticism about our business and relationship had been based on love and concern, not fundamental disapproval of who we were. If we had trusted them with the truth from the start, they might have surprised us with their support and encouragement. But we also recognized that the experience had taught us valuable lessons about authenticity, communication, and the importance of living according to our own values rather than others' expectations. The months of deception had been painful, but they had also forced us to become completely honest with each other about our goals, our fears, and our commitment to the life we were building together. Today, Collins Chen Creative Solutions employs 12 people and serves clients across the country. David and I recently got engaged, and both of our families are enthusiastically planning a wedding that celebrates everything we've built together. My parents frequently mention how proud they are of our success, while David's parents regularly refer potential clients to our business. The relationship between our families and our choices has fundamentally changed. Instead of viewing our unconventional decisions with concern, they now see them as evidence of our good judgment and strong partnership. We no longer need their approval to feel confident in our choices, but having their support makes those choices even more satisfying. The revelation dinners that had seemed so risky at the time had actually been the key to healing relationships that were being damaged by unnecessary secrecy. By trusting our families with the truth about our success, we had given them the chance to revise their understanding of our capabilities and to participate in celebrating what we had accomplished together. The most important lesson from our experience was that authenticity, even when it requires difficult conversations, is always preferable to comfortable deceptions. The temporary protection we had gained from hiding our success had cost us months of genuine connection with the people who loved us most. When we finally chose honesty over self-protection, we discovered that our families were capable of growth and change in ways we had never expected. Our story ended not with the dramatic revelation we had planned, but with the quiet satisfaction of building a life that required no deception, no careful editing, and no apologetic explanations. We had learned to trust ourselves, our judgment, and ultimately our family's capacity to love us as we actually were, rather than as they had once hoped we would become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.